everyone. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're here in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Remember the two special exhibits we have up, both of which are closing this summer. Mississippi Distilled, Prohibition, Piety, and Politics explores the state's tumultuous relationship with alcohol from the colonial period to today. I Am a Man, Civil Rights Photographs in the American South, 1960 to 1970, is curated by Bill Ferris and includes images of James Meredith's integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962, events surrounding the murder of Vernon Damer in 1966, and the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. Remember also that the museums are open free of charge on Sundays from 1 to 5. Join us next week for History's Lunch when Steve Pfeiffer and Denise Morse will present C.T. Vivian in Word and Deed. Pfeiffer co-authored the memoir of Reverend Vivian, who died last year, and Ms. Morse is Reverend Vivian's daughter. We're delighted to have Jessica Russell with us today to present A Living History, Eudora Welty's Garden. Jessica Russell earned her BA in advertising from the University of Southern Mississippi. She's the garden projects specialist at the Eudora Welty House and Garden, where she is involved in the care and interpretation of the Welty Garden. And she works on garden programming, volunteer coordination, and preservation initiatives. Help me welcome Jessica Russell.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, and thanks to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for putting on this program every week and for letting me be a part of it. I'm so thrilled to be here with you today and to talk to you about Eudora Welty's garden. So one of the things that's been really interesting to observe as a, not just a fan of Eudora Welty, but a staff member at the Eudora Welty House and Garden is how people around the world really attach to this writer. Her legacy is worldwide. People know her and love her as very much the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of fiction. And many of the people who know Welty also know that she was an acclaimed photographer. Many of the people, no matter how far away they are from her hometown of Jackson, Mississippi, understand that Welty is part of the South and associate her with that region. And many of them do further associate her with the home that she lived in. She was born in 1909 and moved into this home at 1119 Pinehurst Street in Jackson in 1925 and stayed there until 2001 when she passed away. This was her residence, and many of her fans not only know that she lived there, but make the pilgrimage, and we get to greet them there. And though these are more well-known stories about the author, these are not the stories that we're going to talk about today. Because far fewer people understand what an avid gardener Eudora Welty was, in addition to being a writer and a photographer, and the way the gardening informed the other work that you may be more familiar with. So that's a lesser-known story of her life, and it's what I want to tell you about today. In fact, I would argue that if you really want to know Eudora Welty, you're going to want to know about her garden. It is so much more, it turns out, than pretty flowers. And we have a lot of pretty flowers. But this garden was a big source of inspiration for her work. It turns out it was a tremendous comfort in times of grief. It was a place where she found joy and happiness. And once you know her garden, you're going to recognize it in her fiction. And in her personal writing, you'll start to see it again and again. So I hope that after this talk, and if you get the chance to make future visits to Eudora Welty's garden, that you will, that it will open up a new level of richness for you to maybe the stories that you already are familiar with. So today with me, we're not in the garden, but I'm trying to bring it to you as best I can. I want to take you on a little virtual walk through Eudora Welty's garden, which is open to the public at the Eudora Welty House and Garden in Jackson, Mississippi, and operated by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And as we walk through together today, we're actually going to not just look at the flowers, of course, we'll get to see lots of flowers, but we're going to explore what the garden can tell us about Eudora Welty's life, her work, and also her historic era in Mississippi. Ultimately, we'll ask why we make the effort to preserve it. So the title of this talk is A Living History, and I titled it that way because I really hope that it's been an exciting thing for me to start to think about plants and shrubs and trees as historic artifacts, and really being able to think about plants through a historic lens as historic artifacts to be preserved is an interesting way to think about them. And coming to the Eudora Welty House and Garden is a wonderful way to get acquainted with that concept. One of the ways that this garden is a historic landscape, it's actually historic on a few different levels, so we'll talk about that today. And one of the first levels is the design. I really believe that when people first come into the garden, really before your eye settles on any particular flower or plant, you really encounter and experience the overall style of the design. And you see the arbors, you see the trellises, you see the distinct garden rooms that are defined by mixed plantings of plant material as borders. And this is not an accident. This design was carefully and deliberately planned out by Eudora Welty's mother, Chestina, in 1925 as the house was being built. In fact, she collaborated closely with the architect who was building the house because it was important to her that every room of the house had a beautiful view of the garden. So she didn't just want her garden to look pretty, she was composing beautiful views in time and space and with plant material that changed throughout the year from within her home. And while she pulled this off beautifully, this design wasn't just completely unique to Chestina because she, like us, was operating within the realm of her era, and in her day, she was influenced by what we now know as the arts and crafts movement. And you can certainly see a lot of the arts and crafts influence in her garden. A lot of people think about the arts and crafts movement in relationship to architecture and furniture design, but this movement extended to other parts of life, and it certainly extended into the gardening as well. And so while Chestina's garden that she designed, the Eudora Welty garden, is a wonderful example of this style manifesting itself, it was not the only one of its day. So we like to emphasize to people that when you come to the Welty house, one of the things that you're not seeing, here's what it's not. You're not seeing an upper class garden preserved at the Welty house, even though it may look fancy to our eyes today. Really and truly, if you have been to Monticello, if you've been to Bellingrath here in the bottom, or Butchart Gardens, a lot of the gardens that are historic that have been preserved are representative of extremely wealthy legacies. And not only that, they're grand in terms of the families were probably wealthy, and also the scale is very, very large. This is not what we have at the Eudora Welty house. We have a more typical example of a typical middle-class garden of the 1920s, and so that's pretty special. And for a lot of reasons, people in that era did a lot more gardening. It's not the scope of this talk, but it's a fun thing to talk about. Sometimes we get into that on our garden tours. But Chestina and Eudora, like many of the women of their day, and I also want to mention that many of these gardens of the arts and crafts era, typical home gardens, they were cultivated by the women of the homes. So there's a big thread of the story of women's history that you come to at the Eudora Welty garden as well. But it was during the years 1925 to 1945 that Eudora and her mother Chestina, like many of the other neighbors and women of their day and in their region, were working side by side together in the family garden. So the garden has been restored to that era. And even as Eudora was working with her mother, she was following her mother's original design. And so the garden is restored to that era, so we've restored Chestina's original plans. We'll talk more about that. So the period speaks not only to the Welty family in particular, but to the era in general and to the arts and crafts movement. And just to show you what I mean, this is a really neat little piece. I should have brought this today, but it's really fragile. This is a catalog called Beautifying the Home Grounds. It was put out by the Southern Pine Association in 1924, 1 year before the Weltys actually built the house. So it came out when the Weltys would have been designing their home. If you look at the cover photo, you see a white arbor with a bench on it. And if you open up the page, this is a catalog that you can get different structures for your garden, because you got to have structures in an arts and crafts garden. If you look at the bottom right image, there's definitely an arbor with a bench that evokes what we see at the Welty garden. So if you were living in the 1920s in Mississippi and you were designing a home garden, this too could be yours. So we've talked about the original design and the original structures. But there's more to this garden's living history than that, of course, because it would not be a garden without plants. And so that's what this section is going to be about. The flowers and the shrubs that the Weltys planted, and I do want to emphasize that many of the flowers, shrubs, and trees that are blooming and growing at the Welty garden are original, planted by the hands of Eudora Welty or her mother. And some of them have been restored. We'll talk about that too. But these plants are so old that they're considered heirlooms. And many of them are no longer just readily available in nurseries the way they would have been in their day. So that's part of what makes this garden so special. And then the other obvious part of what makes this garden so special, because many of these plants were planted by Eudora Welty herself, it is a living connection to Eudora Welty. But the original and the restored plants, shrubs, and trees are essentially historic pieces in a living exhibit. And so I want to take you through the garden in terms of a historic perspective. So I want to share with you about some of our original collection. We have a huge original collection, bigger than I can tell you about today, but we can't talk about original flowers without talking about the camellias. The camellias are a huge point of pride in terms of our collection of original plants that go back to Eudora Welty. Eudora Welty's favorite flower was the camellia, and she personally planted or grafted about 40 different bushes around her family home. Many of them are concentrated in this part of the garden, which is just off the side porch. If you're looking at the house from the street, it's the side yard to the left. And this is considered the camellia room, and in typical arts and crafts fashion, you've certainly got a room walls defined by dense shrubs. So all these shrubs that you see are actually camellias. They're huge because they're old. They're actually very slow growing, so it's really astounding to see how tall they've become over the years. And she had, even though she planted about 40 bushes, she had some duplicates. We say there are about 30 unique varieties in our collection, and while there are other botanical gardens that would have many, many more in terms of quantity, what makes our collection very special, again, is that they are heirloom, old-fashioned varieties of camellias that aren't necessarily so commonly available today. You have to look a little bit harder, and in some cases, we have one in particular that is extremely rare. It's called Daybreak, and I know of one other in the South right now that I'm trying to get a cutting from. So it's a really interesting story. We could talk about camellias all day. It could be the topic of a whole different talk, and I can't do that. I did want to just show you a wash of some color just to show you some of the variety. I think one of the reasons Eudora loved camellias is because they do produce a huge amount of variety. And they bloom in the dead of winter, which is also a wonderful, wonderful asset to any garden. But we've got to move on today. So we have a wonderful collection of original camellias, and we have, if you were to take that arbor that you may have seen in the camellia room, you would come out here at this arbor right here in the left side, and you would go to what the Weltys knew as the upper garden. The upper garden had a nice border that Chestina planned to change throughout the seasons. It was important for Chestina to have about a 12-month bloom. She really wanted flowers to bloom all year in her garden, and who doesn't? And the way you accomplish that in Mississippi is you have camellias, and that'll carry you through the winter. And it's easy to grow flowers in the spring. There's a lot of flowers that will stay here in the fall until frost, because our frost comes so late. But the winter's tricky, so camellias do that. And in the summer, that's tricky too, because it's so hot, and many of those plants that are pretty in the spring cannot hold up to the heat. But daylilies can, and Chestina knew that, so she made sure that her border had a lot of daylilies that would come up after the spring roses had faded away, which is what you see if you came in April. And then now it's May, and our daylilies are coming online. And even though from the distance that you're at, it probably looks like she took the same daylily variety and just repeated it, she did not. We have 30 different plants, and similar to our camellias, we have about a dozen, 15 or so different unique varieties of daylilies. These are heirloom daylilies now, but what's really interesting is that when Chestina was purchasing these daylilies and picking them out from her home, and I'll say that Eudora Welty loved daylilies as well and wrote about them and has a lot of fun things to say, had a favorite variety, but it was her mother who first put them in the garden, and we're amazed that many of them are still here. The ones that you see are still here. But when she was picking them out, she was picking some hybrids that had been developed so long ago that they were developed either the year the house was built, 1924, 1925, 1926. Some of the varieties that would have been available to her in that era would have actually been species from the wild, and the F1 hybrids of those species from the wild. We saw the first daylily. Every daylily you see is from Asia, so they're not native to here. So they had to be imported, and so we start to see them being brought over to the West in about the 1700s, and then more come in the 1800s, more come in the 1900s. I think in the 1800s you start seeing them come to the U.S., and all these hybrids start to be developed, and they just kind of became a craze. So in Chestina's day, she didn't think she was planting heirlooms. She thought she was planting the newest and the latest and the greatest, and I think what's so interesting is that didn't stop. So if you're into daylilies today for modern eyes, this is where that train is now. The train never stopped. If you look back at some of the older varieties, you start to see people were really proud that this one on the right, we actually know the identity of this one. It's called Walbun. And do you see how the petal sort of twists? Well, people were very proud of that hybridizing accomplishment. It won a major award in the daylily circles, which is a thing. But look how far we've twisted the petals now. Bright colors, big petals. The daylily hybridizing game has come a long way. And when I say that we have daylilies in our yard, some people have this in their mind, and that's not what we have. The interesting thing I like to make about these daylilies is that the hybridization sort of came at a price, which always happens. And even though they got the big petals and the bright colors, what they lost was fragrance. And it's really interesting when you come to the Eudora Welty House and Garden, many people are surprised to find that our old daylilies, many of them do have a fragrance, because several of those heirloom varieties and F1 hybrids still had not lost their scent. So this is really a cool story for us, and I think an important part of our collection. And even though the direct identity of many of these daylilies the daylilies are so old that, to be honest, many of the names are sort of in danger of being lost to time. And this is a thread that we, as a staff, and that I'm personally trying to. Eudora Welty talks about the continuous thread of revelation, and there are daylily threads I'm pulling on every plant that comes up, trying to find an enthusiast. Do you still grow it? Do you still know anyone who did? And the people who did used to care about these old varieties are retiring. Or worse, and it has just really been humbling to me to see the amount of knowledge about a plant's history that can be lost in a single generation. So think of me when you see a daylily. We're working on the names. Last year we confirmed the two on the right. We're still working on this one on the left, and even though their exact identities may never be uncovered again, the characteristics that they have are incredible and worth putting in your garden. Not only will they take you through the whole summer, if you plant early and mid and late bloomers the way Chestina did, and that's what we've got. We divide these daylilies and offer them for propagation at our plant sale every year, because it's important to keep this germplasm out, and they have fragrance and they're hardy. They've obviously survived decades of neglect. Every curveball our climate can throw at them, they have survived. They did fantastic in the big freeze we just had in February, and some in our collection, despite the daylilies' reputation to die at the end of a day, we have some that stay open for 72 hours, which is just really astounding. So they're old but mighty. Unlike the daylilies and the camellias, I regret to inform you that when you pass through the arbor of the upper garden, you go into the lower garden where the roses grow. The rose bushes that you see, many of our climbing roses are original, we'll talk about that, but the rose bushes that you see are not original plants. Those plants died with Eudora Welty's mother, Chestina. Chestina was an accomplished rose gardener, and she was a force in Jackson, a founding force, I should say, of the Belhaven Garden Club, and just a major force there. She loved tea roses and hybrid tea roses in particular, but they can be finicky. This is a picture of a really old tea rose. The roses that she grew were old-fashioned antique roses, and they were either tea roses, which are usually very fragrant, awfully large, and they become so large and their necks are so weak that look what happens. You can see it well on the one on the right. They nod down, don't they? They nod down. And so if you put them in a vase, they sort of face downward instead of upward. And so hybridizers thought, well, we can do better than that. This is a picture of Chestina in her rose garden and her on the right. Look at those stems. They're not nodding at all. They're nice and straight. They would look lovely in a vase. You don't have to turn yourself upside down to smell them, but guess what? came at a price, because even though they stand up straight, they don't smell quite as fragrant as the old garden roses. So I just love these hybridizing stories and these ideas of what happens when we mix plants. But this was Chestina's pride and joy and love, and unfortunately, when she got too old to care for the garden as much as she would like to, Eudora couldn't really do it either, because she became Chestina's full-time caregiver while also trying to manage her writing career. And yet she knew enough about what was going on in the garden that she knew that the roses were not going to survive, and she didn't have the heart to tell her mother what was happening. So even though Chestina's vision was not what it had been as a younger woman, she had a window that could see the rose garden, and Eudora took the time out of her writing and out of caregiving to find a crabapple tree and dig a hole and plant a tree to screen her mama's view just in case. And they went ahead and died, and she never told her. So that brings us to the story of restoration. What happens when you're showing a historic space and there's a rose garden and there's no roses in it? Well, you've got to put roses in it. But we can't just go to a nursery and get a modern hybrid made in 2019 or 2020, can we? One of the ways that we talk about, I think a lot of people in this audience would be really familiar with the idea of restoring a historic structure. That comes with a whole set of best practices and ethics that you would sort of go along with. And with the garden, you have its own set of ethics and practices to be authentic to your era. So when I bring up the roses, this really is a wonderful time to talk about the restoration of the garden. If you're interested in the story of the restoration of the garden, it would not have happened without Susan Holden. In the 1990s, she was an employee of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. She personally was deeply involved in getting to know Eudora Welty in the 90s, asking her, mining her for memories, looking at her mother's journals, which is what you see, going through black and white photos. This is one of them on the right, to figure out what was planted and what was growing when and where. After that, this is her book, One Writer's Garden. It's available at the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and I believe it's available at the two Mississippi Museums gift shop as well. But it's beautifully written and it's a beautiful story, but once Susan figured out what was planted when and where, she had to then decide what the era of interpretation was going to be. And so for many reasons, she decided to interpret the garden from 1925, when it was designed, to 1945. And that means that anything that was present in the garden after 1945 had to go away so that we could be authentic to that point in time. So that happened. And then if anything was missing, for example, the roses, they had to be restored, but she looked through Chestina's notes to see, well, were there receipts extant? Sometimes there are receipts that were still around. Sometimes there were copious notes. I want you to look at, we were very fortunate, I want you to look at, this is 2 pages out of Chestina Welty's garden journal. This is the map of the upper garden. Can you imagine what Susan must have felt when she saw this? I mean, hallelujah. So we've got every bubble has a number in it, and every number corresponds to the type of flower that's growing, and this has been just an incredible resource for us. And we're lucky that Chestina loved taking copious notes like that. She used to be a school teacher. This is a picture of her in her cutting garden, a black and white picture of her, and she's standing next to a flower called a delphinium. Those of you who are gardeners know that delphiniums aren't known for doing particularly well here in Jackson. And yet here's Chestina standing next to one, and it's higher than her head. So that's Chestina for you. Eudora Welty used to say at a certain time of year that the garden club ladies would come to worship and grit their teeth in Chestina's garden. So where she's standing, delphiniums are annuals, and where she's standing is in the back of the garage, in the backyard, near the upper garden, in what the Weltys called the cutting garden. And I want to pause on that concept. This is part of our garden tour if you come to visit us. I want to go back and remind everyone, like we were talking about, the Welty garden is a typical garden. It wasn't unique to the Weltys, or it wasn't, a completely inaccessible garden that only a very wealthy person could have. This was a typical traditional garden for their time in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. But what they have is a cutting garden, and there's a reason for that. And you can find the reason if you read almost any book by Eudora Welty. There's going to be an occasion. There's going to be a funeral. There's going to be a wedding. Someone's going to get sick. Someone's going to come to visit. And what do people do? They bring flowers. And if you pay attention, she writes a lot and has a lot to say about the kind of flowers people bring. You can even find in Eudora Welty's work, you can find out about the class and where a person is from, depending on, without any other information, depending on the type of flowers they chose to bring for an event, which is a very interesting path to go down. So I want you to pay attention to that next time you crack open a book. But nonetheless, there was a cut flower garden in the Welty garden, and even though they had all these wonderful flowers everywhere, we don't want to butcher our display. What if we want to enjoy our flowers? So we maintain a separate space in our garden and reserve that space explicitly to have flowers for others. And the other great thing about it is they can use that space to plant annuals frequently. Annuals have to be seeded every year. They don't come back like perennials do. And so we continue that tradition. And just like the roses are perennials, so we can source one once. And if we find a good antique rose, then we can put that in there. But annuals we have to source every year, and we do that by going out of our way to find seed companies, and they're getting few and far between. But seed companies who are still offering the old heirloom seeds that would have been available in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and anything beyond that we do not use. And one of the things I like to say when you go into a historic house, people tell you the era, it's interpreted to the 1800s or the 1900s, whatever. And I would say if you go into a historic house, you would expect to not see a flat screen TV, right? If you saw that in a historic home, you would think, well, these people probably don't really understand their history. And it would really take you out of the moment. It would take you out of the era just like that. Well, if you know your plants and you come to the Welty garden, it's the same way. So if we were to plant the wrong seed, or what about those daylilies you saw that were really bright and flashy? That would be that flat screen TV. And for people who know their flowers, they would see that, and immediately they would question us, and they would be taken out of the moment and out of the era. So we go out of our way to preserve that epic. The last section of historic importance is that the fact that the garden is sort of alive in a different dimension, and that dimension is in Welty's fiction. So now that we've explored the garden's historic design and the heirloom plants that are actually in it, I wanted to step back and ask, what can the garden tell us about Eudora Welty's own life and her own fictional work? So it turns out quite a lot. I chose this image from inside the Welty house. This is the secretary where many of her first editions are stored, and you can see Delta Wedding and the Golden Apples and the Ponder Heart and Losing Battles, and you can see of course the collected stories, and on and on. And I just want to make the point that the garden was a source of tremendous creative inspiration for her, because we see it time and time again in many, many stories. If she wants to locate you at a specific time of day, in a specific season, she's going to do it using natural cues much of the time. And, I think it's because Eudora didn't dabble in gardening. The kind of garden that the Weltys had was a high-maintenance garden that took a lot of time, and time is what they gave it. In her personal letters, we know that Eudora Welty writes about spending copious amounts of time in her garden, tending, watering, weeding, planting. And I want to make the point that she and her mother did the hard work of garden maintenance, hands in the dirt types of maintenance, with some but very little help and very few of the modern conveniences that we would rely on to make that an easier process. So there's this wonderful quote from Eudora that said, "The sight of that garden and that scent, if work hadn't proved it real, it would have been hallucination." And I just think that really speaks to how much she knew about being outside and how much time she spent out there. And I think that when you are having extensive experience out of doors every day, in every season, in the morning and in the afternoon and at night, then you become intimately familiar with what flowers bloom at what time with other flowers, what flowers don't bloom together, what insects are chirping at what season and at what moment of the day, what birds are chirping at what season and what moments of the day, what are the weather patterns, what is the light. And it really gets to a point, if you're reading a story and she wants to locate you in a point in time that is early September versus late September, she is going to let you know, and it will be accurate. accurate. And many of that accuracy will come from her natural cues. So pay attention to that next time. So that's an example of just general nature immersion that she got. We know from her personal letters much of that came from the time spent in the garden, but there's a specific moment of inspiration that we do mention on our tour. We know from Welty's personal writing, there was a draft that was part of her memoir, One Writer's Beginnings, and the draft got scrapped from the published work. But because of the Welty collection at Archives, we can go back and look at that draft. And there was a few stories that just fell on the cutting room floor. And one of them was this story that has to do with this particular arbor in the upper garden. This arbor is holding the weight of a notoriously thorny rose. It's beautiful. It's called the Silver Moon because it blooms a big white blossom. But it is very, very thorny. It's almost gone now. I've got some scratches myself. If you look at it, it will scratch you. And Eudora once witnessed a moment where her mother was standing on the ground barking up instructions to a young helper who thought it would be a good idea to help her climb up on the ladder and prune that rose. Well, she was telling him what to do and what not to do, and he was getting cut. And there comes a point where he says that he wishes there wasn't a rose in the world. Oh, and that did not sit well with Chestina Welty, garden club woman, rose grower, and Eudora is watching this. And not only is she watching them, but she's watching the whole scene. And in her moment, it was one of those really hot, humid afternoons in Mississippi where a storm was about to break, but it hasn't. And that's when the sky is the darkest, right? It kind of lightens up when it starts to actually rain. And so she's just watching this whole thing happen. And she says in her notes that got removed from her memoir that was the first time she placed herself at a storyteller's remove, right there on the spot. Think about that. The woman that we know as an author who has this keen power of observation first consciously realizes that she's having this observational skill and moment right here, looking at that in this space, and you can come and you can see it and you can stand there too. I just think that's really incredible. And she said in that quote that got cut, she says, I went on and turned it into one I call a curtain of green at a considerable remove from our real lives then. And she did write a curtain of green. It's not autobiographical, but it was inspired by this moment. Well, she went on to also retell the story again in Delta Wedding. So watch for it there. Delta Wedding has another wonderful moment represented in the garden, and it's one of those things that you just don't see until you go there. But there is a redheaded character in Delta Wedding who also gets the chicken pox. Poor Lady Clare. Her name is Lady Clare. And Delta Wedding was Eudora's first full-length novel that came out in the early 1940s. And in the year 1940, she just happened to plant a camellia in front of her bedroom window where she would have done her writing. I want you to see how close the relationship is, because that's the window, which, by the way, would have been open. She did not do central air ever. And that camellia is called Lady Clare. So just a little interesting nugget. It's interesting to me to see that relationship. There is perhaps no more symbolic use of flowers in Welty's writing than in her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Optimist Daughter, which certainly has many autobiographical moments pulled from Welty's life and experiences and home, and certainly her garden. I just have to say, if you have read it and you come into the Welty garden, you will see the story open up in a completely different dimension. There are flowers in particular that are mentioned symbolically that are here on this screen. The one on the left is a certain camellia, called Chandreli elegans, and the one on the right is a certain type of daffodil called silver bells. And in the story, the protagonist's mother has died long before the events in the story take place. But there are events in the story that make her miss her very much. And Eudora Welty uses these flowers at different points in time to remind Laurel of her mother, Becky. And it's just really beautiful. I was going to mention one of the moments. If you have Optimist Daughter, it is on this copy on page 59. There's a wonderful tale about how the next door neighbor, it turns out, was the recipient of one of Laurel's mother's pass-along plants. She passed along the silver bells, and then when it came time for Laurel to come home because her father had died and she was grieving, that neighbor knew how comforting it would be to show up with a handful of flowers, and not just any flowers, but she brings her silver bells. I think that Eudora Welty knew instinctively that flowers could comfort us in a way beyond just making us happy, but they can connect us to memories and they can connect us to people. And today her flowers help connect us to her in much that same way. I don't have time to tell you all the ways that flowers are used in the Optimist Daughter. That in itself could be another talk. I would love to do that one day if y'all are interested. This one in particular is also a big part of the Optimist Daughter. This is a climbing rose, an original climbing rose. And in the story, if you're familiar with the story, there is an incident with this rose that bookends the events in the story. An incident happens in the beginning, and an incident happens near the end. And so this rose, described just like it's described in the book, just happens to be growing in the garden just where it's described in the book. So it's certainly interesting. When Eudora wrote her memoir, One Writer's Beginnings, that actually came out 10 or so years after her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel came out. And so people had to wait about a decade before they realized just how many autobiographical moments and scenes were in here. If you read the memoir, there's a lot of similarity. When you come into the garden, it happens again. It doubles and redoubles, as Eudora would say, because you start to see that she wasn't just talking about a flower that she remembered. She's talking about a specific flower in a specific place, and for many of these, you can still see them. And I think that's just such a powerful experience when you come to see. I don't have time today to tell you about all of the relationships that the garden nurtured, but if you're interested in that, our Visitor Center at the Eudora Welty House and Garden has a wonderful exhibit that's free called Parade of Bloom, and it goes into detail. And it'll go into detail about Eudora Welty's friends and the Night Blooming Sirius Club that she had. It'll go into her romance with John Robinson and the way they connected over flowers, just a very romantic way. You'll know about her agent, Dermot Russell, and their incredible exchanges about gardening when they should be talking about books, which are collected here in this book, tell about night flowers, and it's her letters, her prose is just beautiful, almost like poetry. You'll learn about Elizabeth Lawrence, and there's a silver bells again. Silver bells were passed to Welty by Elizabeth Lawrence, who is a very significant figure in gardening history. So you can learn about those people in that exhibit if you're interested, but I can't talk about the garden without talking about one of these people. I think it's sort of ironic that the Welty Garden owes much of its existence to the one family member that spent the least amount of time in it. This is Christian Welty. In the middle is Christian with his wife, Chestina, and on the wife is Christian holding a camera. And Christian Welty was Eudora Welty's father, and he died suddenly 6 years after they built their home on Pinehurst Street. Eudora was 22, and he never lived to see her become a published author. I included the camera because you can see that he had some influence on her that was quite significant. But this really rocked the family to its core. And I wanted to just leave you with this quote that Eudora Welty said about that experience to give you an idea of his impact on the garden. She says, "After the death of my father, my distraught mother worked all day long most days in her flower garden behind the house. She had always grown flowers, but now she made a garden out of the whole green slant of our backyard, deep borders in the light and dark of their natural surround of old pines and hardwoods. Now her garden filled all her daylight hours, and becoming her never-ending work, it became her solace. Our garden was a succession of bloom. It was changing and renewing itself every month of the year. It drew me into it too." So I want to switch gears a little bit. We've been thinking a lot about Welty and Welty's garden, but gardens don't just grow. A lot of people think that they do. But some of you may be able to remember a garden that was meaningful to you. Maybe it was the garden of a parent or a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle. I want you to take a moment and just recall that space. What it looked like. Think about what it looked like. Think about how you felt there. Just anything that you remember. And once you have that garden in mind, I want you to ask yourself, does it still look that way today? Right now, if you went back to that place, why or why not? They say a garden can't exist without a gardener. And that's true. Do any other Belhaven backyards look like the Welty garden did in the 1920s? They used to all look like this. And so they don't. So why is this? What happened? What happened? Well, historically, there's a lot to say about what happened, but in the case of the Welty garden, it's our job to preserve it and to not let that garden disappear. And although it takes a lot of work, this is just, for example, this is just a few things that we're doing. We test the soil to make sure that the plants have a lifespan. Y'all, they're not always going to be here, but we want to make sure they're here as long as they possibly can. So we test the soil, we make sure it's okay, we monitor that health. Every plant in our collection is numbered. That doesn't sound very fun, or romantic, but they are all numbered, and we keep up with them and how they're doing, and we track information about them, just like you would track a non-living artifact and keep up with it and have records on it. We cover our plants. If there's going to be a big freeze, this is a picture of a staff member covering plants and uncovering them. On the right, those threads I'm pulling on the daylilies to see, is this one that I found an old image of? Could it be one of the ones that we have in the garden? I don't know. So this wallpapers my office. And so it is a lot of work, but we believe that the artifacts that are in our garden, they are alive, and they are our living connection to Eudora Welty. And they're also a living connection to Mississippi life in her era, one of the rare examples that still exists to this day. And so we study them, we learn from them, and we teach from them, and we try as best as possible to preserve their names and their histories and their stories for future generations. We also have a really interesting, as part of that, this is at Mississippi State University. They are growing backup plants of all the camellias that Eudora Welty planted herself here that are very old. And so they are growing cuttings of those plants represented here at Mississippi State. And from those cuttings, we can take propagates and we can learn about them and just make sure that should anything happen to one of our plants, that germplasm won't be wiped from the face of the earth. And that goes back to restoration ethics. Even if I could find another Lady Clare camellia, it would be so much better if I could find the cutting of Lady Clare that Eudora Welty planted and put it back to just be authentic to this space. And we certainly maintain it with a lot of help and a lot of volunteer help. We work very hard in the garden. There are some serious weeders here today, and I would love for you to join us on Wednesdays. We have a really good time, and they help us keep the garden just looking beautiful for people. Eudora Welty emphasized that this was never to be a show garden. It was a work of love. So if you come, you may see a weed, and that's okay. And it's okay if there's a weed in your garden too, but what matters is there love? Are you tending it? Is it tending you? And that sort of goes back to our why. It does take a lot of work, but we do it for a reason, and we do it to nourish and inspire. This is what Welty wanted with her home, and we know that the space of her home, leaving it open to the public, she felt comfortable with that idea and comforted by the thought that it inspired her. Maybe it will inspire you too. And so that space, and the garden in particular, we know it fueled her creativity. Much is written about the impact of gardens on our well-being. And the wonderful thing is you don't have to actively work the soil to benefit from that. Just being in a garden can do wonders for our mental and emotional states, as study after study has found. As a state-owned operation, I really latch on to the fact that the Welty Garden belongs to every Mississippian. Have you ever considered the fact that the Welty Garden is your garden? It's yours. This is your space. In a state where so much land is privately owned, you see a lot of no trespassing signs, and that's okay. But if you don't own that land, it sometimes can be hard to find a park-like setting where you can go and where you can feel safe, where you can feel peaceful, where you can feel welcome. And that is our space. You're welcome here. We want you here. We want you to be inspired. So yes, this garden is full of pretty flowers, but it is so much more. It is our living connection to Eudora Welty. It tells us so much about her fiction and her life and the era of her day. And it is an inspiring place to be. I think it's very good and important work that the Mississippi Department of Archives and History is doing, and I am so, so pleased to be a part of it. Of course, how to see it. It's free to tour the garden. The hours are here. We have a wonderful audio tour that you can access from your cell phone at eudoraweltyhouse.com. We are offering a Parade of Bloom free exhibit in the Visitor Center, a series of horticultural workshops. We are 1119 Pinehurst Street, eudoraweltyhouse.com, and we are at Eudora Welty House on Instagram and Facebook. I look forward to your questions. Thank
Anyone has
you.
questions, raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you. You can ask Jessica.
Is the crabapple tree still there?
It is not. And the reason it's not, well, I don't know if it had lived or not. That would be a great question for Susan. But if it had been planted after 1945, it would not have been there, and she would have planted that in the 50s or 60s.
In that photograph, is that the little clubhouse behind her?
It is. It is. Mm-hmm.
Would you talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. So the clubhouse is part of our tour. It's a fun part of our tour. When you go into the real house, you're not supposed to touch anything, but the clubhouse was originally built by Eudora's little brothers, Walter and Edward. And Walter went on to become an architect, so I think that's kind of a fun thread of his life. The original structure rotted, so everything in the clubhouse is a restoration, and it was historically restored by Mississippi State University architecture students. It was restored to spec, and so the items in there are replicas, so you can go inside the clubhouse and you can touch and play with all the things that replicate the things that we know Welty and her friends had in there. So the clubhouse has two lives. It started out as the clubhouse for Walter and Edward, and at first it was no girls allowed. But inevitably, the little brothers lose interest, and so that's just in time for Eudora and her eclectic set of young adult friends to take it over, and they reclaimed it and renamed it the Penthouse, and she told her mother that that's where they went to go chew gum. So that's the story of the clubhouse. Thanks for asking.
Eudora also called it the House of Passion's Pent.
House of Passion's Pent. Thank you, Jean.
Jessica, I have been asked on tours if the family planted a victory garden, since that would have meshed with the 1940s.
Yes, they did. And you can read about their successes and failures of their harvests and tell about night flowers. I think that there is a funny telling where, I can't remember if it was strawberries, but there was a berry that the Weltys ended up fighting birds over. And one day they only harvested about 5, and she writes to I think Dermot Russell about how her mother was eating indignantly her 5 berries out of a bowl for breakfast because that's all she got that morning. But they grew peas and tomatoes and maybe some things that I don't know about, but a few things are mentioned specifically and tell about night flowers. Yeah.
Jessica, I know you live in Belhaven. Are there any other Belhaven backyards that at all resemble the Welty Garden?
Not that I've been invited to, but if there are, let me know. There may be a few.
Chris Goodwin has a trampoline in his backyard.
Can I get invited to that?
Yeah, you just got to sign the waiver. Any other questions? Jessica, would you maybe say a few words about what's over here?
Absolutely. So over here on your right side, I've got a bunch of Eudora Welty House fans. People love the photo on the fans. The information on the back is a little outdated. Our hours are better. Look at our website. We're open more than it says we are. And there is a sign-up sheet if you're interested in learning more about the Welty Garden, maybe doing a Serious Weeder volunteer, asking what that's about for our volunteer work days where we get together and work in the garden on Wednesdays. Or if you're interested about any garden news or garden workshops, there's a sign-up sheet there. There may be some brochures, just some little items for you.
Thank you all for being with us today. This is a fabulous program, Jessica. I hope that you will join us next week when we'll look at the life of Reverend C.T. Vivian. But for now, help me thank Jessica Russell for this program.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, fantastic.